Thank you everyone for coming today. Really appreciate it. Welcome to another OVMA Career Connections Series. Thank you for taking the time to join us as we continue to connect our military connected students with leaders whose experiences demonstrate the many career paths available after service. It is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador John R. Bass, a Syracuse University alumnus and one of the most accomplished diplomats to serve the United States Foreign Services. Ambassador Bass dedicated 37 years to diplomatic service, concluding his career at the Acting Undersecretary for Public Affairs, one of the most senior positions in the United States Department of State, where he helped to oversee U.S. diplomatic engagement around the world. Over the course of his career, Ambassador Bass served as a three-time U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Turkey, and Georgia. And he held numerous leadership roles supporting U.S. mission across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Earlier in his career, he also served in key assignments in Washington, including positions supporting the senior State Department leadership and the Vice President. Most recently, as Undersecretary for Management, he served as the State Department's Chief Operating Officer, overseeing global workforce of more than 85,000 personnel operating in 185 countries, managing complex diplomatic operations, crisis responses, and embassy operations worldwide. Today, Ambassador Bass will share insights from his career in diplomacy, leadership, and public service, as well as perspectives on navigating complex global challenges, building a career dedicated to service. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Bass.
Thanks very much. No money changed hands for that overly generous introduction. Can folks online hear me okay? Okay, great. So delighted to be here today. And before I get into my remarks, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge and honor the memory of our service members who've been killed in the last 2.5 weeks. Whatever one thinks of the current conflict, their service and their sacrifice of their families is something every American should remember every day. And I know all of you understand that much better than most of our citizens. And I wish we had a bit more focus across society about that in this moment. I also, for any of you who served, and particularly if you served in the Middle East, maybe spent some time in Iraq, please take care of yourselves right now. I have found myself needing to limit my social media feed and particularly not to watch videos of the CMRAM activating at Embassy Baghdad. It brings back a lot of memories for me for my year there in 08 to 09. So just please be mindful of that and take care of yourselves. Why am I here? Why would I ask to come talk to all of you? Okay, I'm a Syracuse graduate. So what? I worked at the State Department. Okay. I'm a military family member. My dad was in the Air Force ROTC here at Syracuse, graduated in 1955, commissioned, flew B-57s right up until he was killed in 1964 in a training accident. About a month before I was born, as his wing was preparing to rotate into Vietnam on a tour of duty from which a lot of his fellow pilots did not return. So I grew up in those early years around the military, around that sense of service and sacrifice, going to the PX and commissary out at what used to be Hancock Air Force Base, just outside of town, and then at Griffiths, which was down the road in Utica. And then about 10 years later, my mom remarried, and she remarried an architect from the Capital District area who was a World War II combat veteran wounded in the Ardennes. And then went on to be an Air Force reservist who retired as a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. So I continued to grow up around the military, and I thought that's where I was likely headed. And then the Iran hostage crisis happened. And it might seem counterintuitive to you that amid those 444 days of U.S. diplomatic personnel and service members being held captive, a 14-year-old kid might say, I want to do that. But it was my introduction to the whole concept of diplomacy, diplomatic service, network of embassies and consulates around the world that allowed you to serve the country, but do it from these platforms around the world. And from essentially that point on, I was hoping to be oriented to this career. I came for the policy work. I was interested in foreign policy, interested in national security. But the reason I stayed as long as I did, and the reason I wanted to talk to all of you about prospectively looking at careers in foreign affairs agencies or the Foreign Service specifically, the reason I stayed was because the career gave me an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives every day. Every day. Sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways, but it was there every day if I was paying attention. And I found in the last 10 years, after I turned 35, just kidding, as a bunch of my friends from high school and college started to move into the next phase of their life, they put their kids through school, they'd gotten them into, through college and off into their next phase of their life. A lot of my friends I found were really kind of lost. They were searching for purpose in their lives now that they no longer had that particular animating piece about it. And some of them are still looking. And I realized at that point that, I felt incredibly grateful that I've never had a day in my professional life when I didn't feel a sense of purpose and meaning from my work. And that's still there in a career in the federal government, on the civilian side, and particularly in the Foreign Service or the State Department. I think, and the statistics bear it out, that military professionals, whether you've served in uniform or military adjacent, military family members, are particularly well suited for this career or a portion of time in the career. And that's played out by the fact that, somewhere between 25 and 35% of our workforce at the State Department are veterans. I say between 25 and 35% because I've been out a year and I don't know what that looks like after a bunch of the reductions in force last year. But it's pretty significant. And a big part of it is service members who somehow became aware of the diplomatic service, our network of embassies and consulates around the world during their years in service and said, that looks really interesting. I'm kind of interested in that. Most obvious one being former Marine security guards. We have a MSG detachment at virtually every diplomatic facility around the world. And there's a really special relationship between the Department of State and the Marine Corps as a result of that, and as a result of the fact that for many years, until about 3 years ago, the Marines had a dedicated mission to plan, prepare, exercise, and execute specialized security missions for embassies and to conduct non-combatant evacuations if we found ourselves in those positions. So got a lot of former active duty Marines among our ranks, but we got a lot of folks from across the services as well. And I think the first reason is because it is a way to continue to serve outside of uniform, but in some ways that are very similar. The State Department is an organization. The Foreign Service, right in our name and right in your job title, whether you're a Foreign Service officer or a Foreign Service specialist, right? Service is part of the title. It's part of what we do from day one. Very mission-driven organization, very task-oriented in a lot of ways. Not everybody's going to describe it that way. I've got a lot of colleagues who would never characterize what they do as being task-oriented. But if you look at what they do every day, absolutely where they are. We're very mission-driven. We get a lot of variety in what we do. So it's another one of those places where you can change jobs, change where you're living without having to change employers and deal with all that disruption. And for those of you who did serve and liked moving every couple of years and liked getting that different set of experiences, and maybe if you served overseas, you enjoyed being in that foreign country, foreign culture, trying to understand what was going on. It's absolutely the right career for you. A lot of the foreign service would feel very familiar to those of you, particularly who served. It's a rank-in-person organization. We have a competitive promotion system that is like the uniformed services up or out over a period of time. We have a range of specialties within that larger umbrella. I have colleagues who are security professionals. I have colleagues who are construction engineers. I have colleagues who are IT professionals. And then I have colleagues who are, economists and public communications professionals who try to explain what the U.S. government is doing and why around the world, and what folks in different societies might not know or understand well about the United States at a particular moment in time or in the background. And it's a hierarchical organization. So if you liked those aspects of the military, liked relatively clear chain of command, and a decent amount of prioritization in what you're expected to do in a day, a week, a month, a year, you'd see a lot of similarities there. It's also a culture of sacrifice. We do all of the same things that happen in the uniformed services where, your tours of duty are anywhere from a year to 3, occasionally 4 years. So very regularly you're picking up stakes and you're changing jobs, you're changing where you live, where your kids are going to school, where your spouse might be employed, except instead of that being predominantly within the United States, it's predominantly happening in the rest of the world. You can expect to spend at least half of a career overseas. A lot of people spend almost all of a career overseas. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum who will be down around a third. But generally speaking, you're going to serve across a 30-year career, you're going to serve in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different countries doing different things as you work your way up through the ranks. Unfortunately, given the way in which the world is today, another piece of that sacrifice is separation from family. We got a bunch of places around the world that are unaccompanied tours, so we only have a career professional who's going to serve in a role go to that location because it's too dangerous for families. Generally speaking, those places are 1-year assignments. To a certain extent, they're 2-year assignments. But they do occur. And I think unfortunately, we're probably going to see more of those places for at least the next year or two, until we see how this current conflict settles out. And we see to what extent the Iranians are able to perpetrate a wider range of asymmetric responses, targeting, among other things, our diplomatic facilities and communities around the world. There are also any number of places where you're prospectively sacrificing your everyday health. You become acquainted with a wide range of GI, exotic ailments, and other things of that nature, just as a matter of course, given local conditions. What is a bit different about our service and when I say that, not in terms of individual service, but the collective foreign service. What's a bit different is it is more of a culture of scarcity, by which I mean for the last 40 years, and I think well before that as well, the State Department has not enjoyed the financial resources to be able to do everything it is asked of it. We've had boom and bust cycles in terms of budget. New administrations come in with a big list of ideas about new ambitious things they're going to do by and large. And the budget to do all those things is about 3 years later, given the federal budgeting cycles and when they're planned, how they're structured. And if we're lucky, we would come out with the operational resources we needed. But in my experience, which included 3 years in that chief operating officer role, we had a big gap between what we needed to do the missions we were given and what we actually had. So that requires a lot of ingenuity, a lot of self-starting, a lot of creative workarounds, certain amount of triage, and a lot of discipline in the field to basically say, yeah, I know you want me to do that, but that's on the if we have time, if we can get to it, end of the spectrum, as opposed to yes, absolutely, we're going to do every last thing you're asking us to do. It's also a bit different in orientation in terms of and I know I'm generalizing here, but if the purpose of the U.S. Armed Forces and the surrounding civilian structure that supports the uniformed military and the services is to be prepared for conflict, for use of force, that is the principal animating purpose for now the Department of War. The State Department needs to look not just at what it's doing if there is a conflict, but what happens well before, what happens long after, and ideally, what happens instead of conflict. So our mission is, and we do this in partnership with the military, with DoD, DOW, other civilian parts of the government. Our mission is in part to figure out alternatives to conflict, to protecting our interests, advancing our interests, protecting the nation, promoting our objectives without having to use force, or when force is used, to use it as efficiently, economically, and for a shorter period of time as possible to achieve the designated objectives. So the mission's broader in some respects, a lot more diffuse. Plenty of people in the Foreign Service don't work on core hard security. They're not even close to it. They're working on advancing U.S. economic interests. They're negotiating trade agreements. They are promoting U.S. exports. They are looking to help U.S. companies secure public contracts, government contracts from other governments, or to ensure that there's a level playing field that enables the U.S. private sector to compete effectively in that market. They're looking at ways to promote foreign direct investment in the U.S. to directly create jobs here at home. Other people are supporting American citizens overseas, which is one of our core missions. And that runs the gamut from the dramatic, in terms of supporting Americans who find themselves in harm's way, whether because they were caught out by surprise when something happened, or because they engaged in human behavior and ignored all the warnings and went someplace that was dangerous anyways, and then got there and had buyer's remorse and wanted some help to leave. That's one end of the spectrum, but you go all the way down to a bunch of the services that are normally provided by state and local government here in the US. If you're an American citizen living overseas and you have a child, you can't get a birth certificate from Syracuse, New York. You go into the embassy or consulate and you get the equivalent of a birth certificate issued by a jurisdiction here in the US. And it's the equivalent document for that child's entire life. It is the birth certificate that they have that proves their citizenship. We issue any number of US passports all around the world, and also here at home. So if you've gotten a passport, wherever you applied for it, that application came into the State Department, which verified your citizenship and then went through the process of issuing that passport. And we also issue visas for foreign nationals who want to come visit the US, whether it's for a short duration or all the way up the spectrum to folks who are intending to immigrate, who qualify, and who have reached that point in their on the wait list, given how long it is for potential immigrants who would be coming because they have ties to family members who are already US citizens. Once they get through the queue, then US embassies and consulates actually go through the process of ensuring they're qualified and can meet the admission requirements and issue that immigrant visa. And there's a whole bunch of other things we do from US embassies and consulates around the world. But all of that is, with those three core missions in mind: protecting the nation, promoting our interests, supporting our citizens. I will tell you, it, for me, was just an amazing career. Could not have asked for a more remarkable career. Didn't get rich doing it, but I have had a life rich in experiences. I've gotten to do things that I never would have imagined. I got to meet people I never would have imagined. And I got to play a role in bending the arc of history a little bit in the right direction, in ways that are gonna, I think, stick down the road. I got to bend the arc a little bit for a period of time before it snapped back in some other places. And I got to make a difference in people's lives every day. And so if there's anything I can tell you, you got specific questions, or you want to ask questions about the world, I'm happy to take it wherever you'd like. Thanks for coming in person, and for those of you online, thanks for joining us. Yeah, please.
I'm Krupa Patel. I'm from Air Force ROTC right now. I'm a freshman. I was wondering, what is your favorite memory or assignment of your whole career?
Oof. So probably my favorite overseas assignment was serving as ambassador to Georgia. Partly because of the unique nature of that country and that society, particularly at the time I was there, which was about a year after the Russian invasion, and for the 3 years thereafter. So we had a lot of extra resources to work with. Georgians, by and large, were incredibly grateful for the support during and after the conflict. It's an incredibly hospitable culture to begin with, so very welcoming to Americans. And then there's some really interesting, unique things about it, like the fact that it is geographically the size of West Virginia, but it has every climate zone in the United States in that space. It goes from desert all the way up to through alpine and some little pockets of subtropical. And it's also an incredible wine culture. There are over 400 grape varietals that are unique to that little geography. And a winemaking, not just tradition, but viticulture that is, thousands of years old. So you get all this crazy variety. You get some bad wine. But anyways, it was a great experience. And when I was there, we did things that ranged from creating a second modern road network in the southern part of the country that ran east to west, that was well back from the administrative boundary lines of the breakaway regions that Russian troops were occupying. And they were in a position to be able to shell the main highway, which was the economic lifeline for the country, so not ideal. But we were doing that work. We worked out an agreement with the Georgians whereby they became, after the US, the largest per capita contributor to the international security force in Afghanistan. And they weren't just pulling guard duty at major forward operating bases. They were, and they insisted on being deployed with the Marines in Helmand province, so they could learn the craft of a modern Western military, and particularly the US military. And then we did all kinds of other things as well. But just sheer variety, it was pretty awesome. Close to being famous as I ever want to be.
Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
I do have a couple questions online. Marilyn, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for speaking with us, John. My name is Marilia, and I, just like you, had honestly thought of having a career in the foreign services. I actually wanted to go into global diplomacy, and I have a few questions, actually. I don't want to monopolize the time, but I noticed that you served under multiple administrations and with different foreign policy approaches. So how did you stay grounded in your role when you personally disagreed with some policy directions?
Sure. Great question. So first thing I would say is, just like everybody who serves in uniform, we all raise our right hand and swear an oath. And our oath is to the Constitution of the United States. And so in the course of evaluating policy of a given administration, I always, well, not always, but over time I learned that if I had a disagreement in my own head about it, first thing, did it violate my oath? Was I no longer in a position where I could faithfully execute and fulfill the obligations of my oath? And I had a couple of times when I was ambassador to Afghanistan, when I really had to think very seriously about that. And there were things that the administration was doing in 2018 in particular that I disagreed with, and I wondered if it was time for me to hang it up, and I couldn't serve anymore. And I really thought about it, talked to some of my former mentors who are no longer in government, which included a couple of general officers who I served with. And in the process of that, I realized that my objections had nothing to do with the body of work and the objectives that I was entrusted with as ambassador to Afghanistan. And I also thought about what it would mean if I was absent from Afghanistan in that period of time and there was no US ambassador. And I concluded that my obligation, as I interpreted my oath, meant that I needed to stay, notwithstanding some of my frustrations with other aspects of policy. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is, you are not, it's an incredibly varied career. So if there's a part of the world geographically or an issue set that you don't want to work on for whatever reason, there generally speaking are lots of opportunities to do other things. And you don't have to personally work on that. So you limit the number of times where your personal values or your belief about a certain policy comes into really sharp relief with what's going on in the moment. And then the third piece is for many years, the State Department has had a formal dissent mechanism under which any employee in the department can send a memo to the Secretary of State objecting to US policy. In any given year, that dissent channel, as it's called, may see a half dozen to a dozen responses, or it may see multiple dozens, depending on what's going on and how controversial it is. There were a lot of dissent messages following October 7th, as the Biden administration wrestled with how best to support Israel, engaging in some aspects of legitimate self-defense, and how to try to deal with the extent to which Hamas was, in my view, using an entire society as a human shield, and in purposely creating circumstances in which there was civilian harm and humanitarian suffering. But each and every one of those dissents that comes in, first and foremost, identity of the drafter is protected. It's only known to a handful of people, unless they choose to make it clear to everybody that they're doing it. Personally, I don't, and I can come to why I don't think that's a good idea. That comes in, goes to the Office of Policy Planning, first thing they do is they send it to the secretary and about 4 or 5 other senior officials. And then they task the relevant person at the assistant secretary level who's got responsibility for that issue area to prepare a response to that initiative. There are great dissents that are well thought through, that are well reasoned, that come about only after the individual or the group of people who are promoting it have done everything they can to persuade people to choose a different option, and they see no other recourse. And there are bad dissents, which in my view are more performative, where it's the first thing people do, as opposed to actually trying to work through a deliberative process to get a different outcome. And some of those people who have done the latter then break the cardinal rule, in my view, which is to make it public, because it is supposed to be an internal process that allows for constructive dissent but respects the policy process and enables leadership to make informed choices without being pressured by a public campaign. And generally speaking, for those kinds of issues, there's already a public campaign. And the expectation should then be that if you dissent and policy stays the same, well, then you've got three options. Option one, you recognize you've been heard and you continue to well and faithfully implement the policy to the best of your ability. Number two, you decide that you're not going to work on that issue set anymore and you go do something else. Or number three, you resign your oath. You resign your office because you can't effectively serve knowing that the US government continues to do X or Y when you feel a compelling moral obligation to see us doing other things. I hope that answered your question.
I do have a question, actually, I have a question from Alexander Johnson. It says, I work closely with Civil Affairs team and the State Department, as well as a couple years ago on a deployment working on reparations in Syria. I found the work very fulfilling, and I was wondering the major difference in scope or lifestyle from the military side to the diplomatic side. Is it night and day? I also have children, and I worry about living with them in those types of environments. If you have any thoughts about that.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for all you did in Syria. Really hard place, hard time. I had a lot to do with that for a few years in the mid-teens. There's a number of similarities between work that civil affairs teams do and what our development professionals at USAID used to do, and then other work that embassies are doing. But it's not all like that. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with nature of the country and society to which you're assigned, right? Is it ridden by conflict? Is it unstable? Is there currently a shooting war, or was there recently? Is there a lot of terrorism or not? Or is it pretty stable all the time or most of the time? Related to that, for families, there's a wide range of environments around the world. There are a lot of environments that are absolutely safe. Well, they're as safe as any major urban city in the United States. Capital cities are as safe as Washington, D.C. is, which is to say most people, most days, most places are not going to have any problems at all. If you're walking by yourself at 4 a.m. in a neighborhood that statistically has a high incidence of muggings or those kinds of things, whether you're in New York or Washington or Ankara or London, then you're making choices that are going to put you at a bit greater risk. But environmentally, it's quite safe and stable. Second thing I would say is what's perhaps a bit different for foreign service families relative to a pretty big subset of military families overseas is that our folks are by and large, with some exceptions, but by and large living out in the society to which they're assigned. They're not cloistered on base in base housing. And most of our people have a degree of language skill that give them an ability to essentially become part of the society and to feel better, more acutely, what's going on. They learn, if there are parts of town you need to not be in, or things that are happening in local politics, for example, that are going to spike the prospect of protests. they're paying attention to those kinds of things. And you're part of a community that is all doing the same thing. And so generally speaking, folks are able to continue to live and work, even in an environment that might feel a bit unsettled. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah, please.
Sir, my name is Boren. I'm an Army captain. I'm also actually I applied to be a financial management specialist back in 2024. I would certainly want to try again. But I have two-part questions. Number one is, in your opinion, what is the most important skills in both in terms of the hard and soft skills? And second question regarding my personal life. I understand bringing family on tours overseas, especially. I will feel unfair to not have to for my spouse to not have a fulfilling career. And so what is your advice on for family members that are with you?
Sure, both great questions. Most important skills.
As a coming in as a
Yeah,
early stage.
yeah. So I mean, in some cases, you obviously want to have good technical skills related to whatever that professional niche is. But more importantly than that, adaptability, flexibility, dedication. I talked about culture of scarcity. That often means in embassies overseas, they are not fully staffed, so people are covering down on a second portfolio. They're maybe working longer hours. Depending on where you are in the world, there are good odds that you're going to work a number of US holidays because you will have visitors from the US Congress coming on those holiday periods because that's when Congress is in recess. And so that's when they travel overseas. I think the years I was in Turkey, I think Christmas was the only holiday we didn't have visitors in 3 years. I think, however, the most important quality is to be other-oriented, to be interested in whoever's on the other side of the conversation, to be listening before you're talking or on transmit, to be trying to understand that perspective, whether it's your colleague, whether it's somebody in a foreign government or a foreign business. For many years, I used to describe if you're an American diplomat, you don't realize it, but you've already got a megaphone in front of your mouth because you're speaking on behalf of the United States. People paid more attention to what we said, did, thought. And so often people would, think they had to be extra strong on a particular point when the power of the symbol of the flag and the US government behind them already dialed it up. And I watched a number of very capable, talented colleagues not be effective in certain environments because they were always on transmit, or they didn't take the time once they arrived somewhere to really figure out the cultural nuances that would enable them to be effective at the cross-cultural communications in that particular place. To career families, it's another perspective, challenge, and sacrifice. Not every country in the world allows spouses of diplomatic and consular personnel to work on the local economy. And technically, although fortunately we've stayed out of this ground, at least we had, prospectively, folks who were working virtually could be considered by local authorities to be, essentially working in that country, even if what they were doing had nothing to do with it. Because that work is not associated with the embassy. So technically it's local employment. As I said, fortunately, and please, to the extent, well, I guess we're recording this, so the cat's already out of the bag. Moving right along. Folks who have a portable career, there are places in the world where there may not be great opportunities locally, but there would be virtually, where you may have some bandwidth issues. So prospectively, you're looking at a higher cost for yourself if you need to have a Starlink subscription. Now there are more workarounds for that than there were even 3 or 4 years ago. We do have a set of positions that varies embassy to embassy, and it to a degree varies year to year, where family members can fill vacant positions within an embassy. And we have a separate program that allows family members who have worked for a couple of years in an embassy to then become part of a reserve corps that allows them to then fill civil service jobs in Washington that are vacant for those periods of time when the principal person is rotating back to the headquarters to work. So there are ways in which we've tried to expand family employment. We have a good agreement now with DoD that allows for families where one works for state and one works for defense, or where the state person can essentially telework to their state position from wherever their accompanying service member or the service member they're married to is assigned. And we have a number of positions in Washington that people can do remotely from overseas. So we've increased the flexibility, but depending on where you end up, it's potentially a challenge.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have a question here?
Sorry, I would say one other piece related to that. We have a not small number, I don't know what the percentage is now. I want to say it's in the low to mid-teens of 2 career families where both of them are employed by the State Department. And there are some challenges associated with that to be compliant with anti-nepotism requirements under federal law. So you can't have spouses working directly for each other, which makes smaller embassies hard if they are at an equivalent grade or time in service. But there's a lot of opportunities to have fulfilling careers with both people in the service. You end up probably spending a bit more time in Washington than most people. And you have to be thoughtful about, who's going to have the lead in the next assignment cycle, so that you can make sure you've got the anchor assignment and then you figure out the second assignment.
Any other questions, Dorothy?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for coming here to speak with us today. I had a question about like American diplomacy and how it's changed over the time of your career. How did you observe the general like dynamics and kind of like work environment change when you started out as opposed to when you were last working at the State Department?
Great question. I hope everybody's got like 4 hours. Some pretty significant changes, some of them positive, some of them neutral to net negative. On the positive side of the house, I saw an organization that became more adept at valuing the diversity and richness of experiences of the workforce that was coming in the door and leveraging that, particularly for first and second generation Americans who were now serving the nation. And I will tell you, based on, 35 years plus, whatever, there are not that many countries, even today, where you will see people representing that country from their diplomatic service who are not native born of that race and ethnicity. You see it increasingly over the last 10 years from a range of European countries, but not to the degree that you have in the United States and have had in the United States. I've seen our service become more, until recently, meritocratic, where people were getting opportunities based on what they knew, what they could do, rather than what they looked like. That was particularly true until very recently for women. The service I joined in 1988 there were a lot of women colleagues, but they did not get the equivalent opportunities that the dudes got by any stretch. And over the last 15 years, we saw a lot more women who joined in the late 80s, early 90s, move into leadership positions and serve with distinction and do really well. Over that similar period of time, as you had, visible role models like Secretary Albright, Secretary Rice, women moving into, and women of color moving into the most senior positions in the department, it changed the dynamics of the deliberative process of that meeting where you're trying to get a range of opinions where we don't know what we're doing. We're trying to figure it out, and we're going to hear from more than just the loudest voice in the room. We also have gotten much better at the non-traditional aspects of diplomacy. It took us a while, but we had a very good cohort working on issues related to technology and technology standards around the world. Had a great climate office for many years. Had a lot of people thinking about ways in which the digital age was changing the way governments interacted with each other, the way governments interacted with their citizens, challenges of disinformation, all those things, benefits. The mostly net negative. I'd say neutral, digital age. Great opportunities to reach a much wider range of audiences and to do that in a really cost-effective basis. Great new opportunities for spouses and family members to work because they can work virtually. Ability to navigate ups and downs with local instability when your workforce can work on a distributed basis from their residence and get, anywhere from 100% down to, let's say, 40% of what they might get done in a day done, even if they're not in the office. Flip side of that, particularly for senior folks involved in making policy, the tsunami of information now available and sorting signal from noise, the facts and the opinion that really inform the hard choice before you from everything else is much harder today than it was even 5 years ago, or 2 years ago for that matter. And related to that, the way in which the digital age has conditioned people fellow citizens, and by extension, elected representatives to expect immediate answers and immediate action to whatever has just popped up in their feed. It's like as far from a deliberative process as you can get. And so when you're wrestling with really hard choices, particularly around ones that involve, life and death, use of force, those kinds of things, and there isn't a right and a wrong answer, and there isn't a good option and a bunch of bad options, your choices may be the best you're going to do is it will be 10% worse, all the way down to 200% worse. And you're wrestling with some of the trade-offs among that. And the expectation is your policy is going to change every day to keep up with developments on the ground. A, you can't do it. B, you shouldn't do it. But C, you have to deal with the psychological tension of managing those expectations for why don't you have an update for me? Why hasn't this been solved? And then during crises, in terms of supporting American citizens, or an affected population. Now we have the challenge of what I call networked advocacy. Used to be during a crisis overseas. Let's take the Asian tsunami in 2005. That happens, and suddenly 15,000, the families of 15,000 Americans are worried about their loved ones who either live or were traveling in the most affected areas. Or maybe they were traveling there, because it's been a while since I've talked to my own. They would pick up the phone and call a State Department. Maybe they'd call every day. A few of them would call twice or three times a day. But they would recognize that there's unlikely to be an update because it's 12 time zones away, and we just don't know what's happening there yet. There isn't a lot of information coming out of it. Juxtapose that with the collapse of the Islamic Republic in Afghanistan and the non-combatant evacuation in August of 2021, which I went back for and led the civilian side of. Every Afghan who was afraid for what that meant to them, who had the number of an American, sent that American multiple text messages. They sent messages to every American they knew, understandably. Most American citizens who were in Afghanistan did the same thing. And then every one of those people, well, everyone, a percentage of the people to whom they sent those messages turned around and forwarded those messages to their network. And then everybody in that network, or a not small percentage of that, sent queries about the same person to the State Department, to their House of Representatives, their congressmen, their senators, and anybody else they could think of. And so we were overwhelmed with this tsunami of advocacy. Much of it very compelling, but very difficult to manage all that data. And many people who were like advocating wanted an immediate answer. They came out and they're like, so-and-so is right outside Abbey Gate. So-and-so is right outside Northgate. Why can't you go get them? Without any context for the realities of the geography, the danger, the overcrowding, right? The difficulty, it'd be kind of like saying, they're in the dome. Why can't you get that? And the dome has got 80,000 people in it. Where are they in the dome? Well, they're standing by a column. Okay, that narrows it down, but you see what I'm saying? So that's been a real challenge. Now we got better at it as we went, but it's still really challenging managing that expectation gap. And it's particularly challenging to manage the expectation gap around how quickly policy should get made and how quickly there should be results from whatever that policy is.
Thank you.
Any concerns about continuity or knowledge transfer given such, I think, significant change happening in
Um,
between?
So, how much time do you have? Yes, but not only because of the choices that the new administration has made about reorienting the direction and the organization of U.S. foreign policy and national security, and also, you know, the choices they made about what we need to have business units to do or not. But even before that, there were challenges with knowledge transfer in our organization. And to the earlier question, you know, unfortunately, one of the through lines across my career is we did not do a good job of knowledge transfer and knowledge management for a knowledge economy workforce. And it used to make me crazy. And I, you know, in a couple of earlier iterations in the early teens, like tried to begin changing that and got some traction, but there wasn't the funding for the software. There wasn't the buy-in from leadership for the cultural changes. The politicos didn't care. And so it never had the priority it needed in the organization. I will say, you know, and state traditionally was not known as an innovator. I used to say that our motto was yesterday's technology today at tomorrow's prices. Partly that was unfair because we made some big bets that were unlucky. The State Department was an early adopter of pre-PC tech. We were one of the early big consumers of Wang word processing. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It was essentially a PC-like device that was networked that allowed you to do, it was some of the earliest online word processing. And they were quickly eclipsed by PCs and went out of business. And we followed them all the way down the slope. And then 15 years later, 10 years later, we did the same thing with BlackBerry. Where we got super wedded to BlackBerry. And I remember people debating like BlackBerry versus Palm Pilot. Jesus. Anyways, and we followed BlackBerry all the way down. But we've gotten better as we've gotten along. And just to fast forward, state was the first federal cabinet department to develop and publish an AI policy for use of AI within the organization. And it was at least a year, if not 18 months ahead of anybody else in the federal government. And we worked with Anthropic early to develop essentially an in-house large language model that was limited to State Department information. So there's opportunity there. But with respect to what's going on now, like, it's bad. It's bad. They fired almost all of our experts on missile proliferation, missile technology proliferation, and related systems. And so if you're looking for expertise to evaluate what residual capacity, just as one example, what residual capacity Iran maintains, as part of your effort to evaluate, are we far enough along through this where we've degraded them sufficiently so we can wind it down? A big body of the expertise in the federal government is no longer in the federal government. And that's before we get to things like evaluating the North Koreans' missile technology or Pakistan's effort to develop more sophisticated ballistic missiles for its ongoing competition with India. And that's just one example. There are unfortunately a whole bunch of examples related to that. Saw a press report this morning, I can't remember from where, with one of my former colleagues noting that the entire group of experts and diplomats that focused on energy diplomacy were all fired last summer. So the people who would have been predicting the challenges around the closure of the straits or working through a set of scenarios around, okay, if Iran's response is X, here's the impacts on oil markets. If it's Y, here's the impact. If it's Z, none of those people are in the federal government at the State Department. And there isn't the equivalent expertise at the Energy Department because they've got people who are knowledgeable about the markets, but they don't have the same set of relationships with foreign governments, foreign counterparts, to understand how those governments think about these issues.
I got an online question from Jared. Can you hear me, Jared?
I can, yes. Ambassador Bass, hi, this is Jared Hansbrough. We actually crossed paths in Iraq, I think in 2008. I was part of General Petraeus' staff, worked with Chuck Bollington, the embassy FMO, and I was co-located there supporting the PRTs at the time.
Well, it's good to see you. Yeah, been a long time.
Yeah, it has been a while. So my question, it was a unique setup in 2007, 2008, where you would have General Petraeus, Ambassador Crocker doing remember like the morning updates, which really synchronized the staffs, and we were all co-located there in the embassy. And even I saw the model in Afghanistan as well. What's your vision today? Have we maintained those lessons? Because at the time it was really close coordination between the country team and the theater headquarters. But I've been out for 10 years. I've retired. So have those lessons learned, or are those perishable lessons which are getting dusty again? What do you think?
So I think it's situation specific. I would say that model was continued to be well and trained at least through 2020. General Nicholson and then General Miller, the commander of respective commanders in succession for U.S. forces in Afghanistan when I was there. We worked really hand in glove the way Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus did. And I had similar relationships with, 3 COCOMs and the JSOC commander when I was ambassador to Turkey, and we were trying to deal with a lot of overlapping priorities and initiatives and some real inherent contradictions in U.S. policy. I think today, some of that continued through the last administration. You saw it particularly in CENTCOM, to a degree in PACOM around some of the Taiwan contingency planning.
Sure.
But where I think it's going to be a challenge going forward is with the end of the CT-centric effort and all of the deployments associated with those, we no longer have a cohort of our professionals working with U.S. uniforms operationally. You have a limited number who are foreign policy advisors in the COCOM headquarters, but as there's no substitute. That's not the same as being partnered with a brigade commander or somebody who's got some very specific operational responsibilities, and you're working in that environment, and those career diplomats are understanding what that environment's like, sharing some of the same risks, learning some, getting some insights into the culture of operational units, the language of operational units, all those kinds of things. And so I think we're, going to be okay for a few more years, but that cohort of people who, you know, are growing up together is sunsetting.
Right.
So we're going to go back to more of the model where, and by the same token, state has also reduced the number of foreign policy advisors across DoD. They are reducing the number of people in who are on detail for a year in a professional military education environment. And so even that opportunity outside of whatever's going on to learn about your counterparts and figure out how the same word means two different things and work through some of that. There's going to be less of that going forward, and that concerns me a lot.
Okay, yeah, that helps. I agree with you. The relationships we built during that time frame really were very strong. It was a valuable perspective I've carried forward since then. So hopefully that can continue in some form and fashion. Thank you.
All right, and one more final question. I think it's a good question to end the session, and I'm sure some of you probably want to connect directly with Ambassador Bass. The question is from Aurelia. If you could redesign how the Foreign Service develops officers, what would you change?
Oof.
I told you it's a good one.
Wow. So the very first thing I would change is putting in place a structure and an expectation for career-long learning, much of which is self-initiated, that is similar to expectations of military officers across a career, and to a certain extent, military professionals. It is the rare ambassador or assistant secretary in the State Department who will, at the outset of their tenure, walk in and give their workforce a reading list, the equivalent of a commander's reading list. We don't have the same requirements for formal education as you advance through a career. And we also rely much too much on luck of the draw in terms of ensuring that the folks who end up in our leadership cohort have a blend of policy and operational experience. I had a lot, but that was because both sides interested me. And so I purposely looked for doing things on both sides of the house, so to speak. I have a lot of colleagues who were policy wonks who didn't want to have to look at what was going on under the hood. And then when they found themselves in leadership positions, particularly of embassies, were really ill-equipped to deal with those challenges. And for some, it was a career ender when, you know, they ended up allowing a toxic environment or sexual harassment or embezzlement from, you know, their financial management operation. So I would start, and this is actually something we're talking to Congress about, some of us formers, as they look at updating the Foreign Service Act of 1980. I would look for ways to bake in the expectation that if you seek a leadership position, and that would be a defined subset, you will need to have the following boxes checked to be eligible to compete for that.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you so much, everyone. Round of
My
applause.
pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone online and in here. I mean, not every day we get to connect directly with an ambassador, let alone an ambassador that served in the Middle East, especially with everything going on currently. It just makes it all much more interesting. So again, thank you for coming. I'm sure all of you probably want to connect with him, you know, after we conclude here, and I'm sure you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, good. Thank you so much. And then just so you guys know, Hearst is our next one, and that's Friday. And Hearst does not just magazines, but they have television, they have multimedia. And so that we'll be sending out that link. But again, that's coming up. And then we have 2 more sessions. I think we have Morgan Stanley in April, and then we're going to do like an etiquette presentation. Many of you didn't go to the etiquette dinner, so we wanted to bring etiquette to you. So this is both dining etiquette and business etiquette. And so just be looking out for that email as well. But again, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right,
Thank you. And thank you all once again, particularly those of you who are still serving. Really, really appreciate it.